Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the endgames with the positions in which one side has a king and pawn and the other side has a king and pawn. And those endgames occur very frequently, and one general rule is that they are draws. However, there are of course exceptions, and anything can happen. One thing which is hard about these endgames is that they are hard to calculate precisely in some positions, as we are going to see, and there are still certain rules which you have to follow. Firstly, I would like to point out that three crucial principles apply. That's the principle of the opposition, meaning that once your kings let's say the black king is on h5 in this position, once the kings are one square or three squares and no number of squares apart, whoever doesn't have to move has the opposition. That means that the other side has a compulsion to move and has a worse position. The second principle is the rule of the square. For example, if you take the d4 pawn, its square, meaning the square in which the black king has to be able to reach in his next move to be able to catch the pawn on its way to promotion, is crucial for a visual understanding of the board. So, for example, you draw the square, a perfect square which is comprised of the pawn's square and the squares it takes the pawn to get to the promotion square, which is in this case 4 squares, and then you make a perfect square. So only on his next move, if black is to move, if he is able to reach the d7 square, then he is within the square and the white pawn can be caught. That is, of course, if the pawn isn't on d6. So the rule of the square is going to be crucial for a visual understanding. And the third principle, and probably the most important one, is going to be the rule of the critical squares, which means that, once again, let's imagine that the pawn is on f2. The pawn on f2 has critical squares on e4, f4, and g4, which means that if the white king is able to reach any single of these squares, it's inevitable that the f2 pawn is going to promote. Conversely, the d4 pawn has critical squares on c6, d6 and d6, so let's imagine that the d6 pawn isn't here. If the white king is able to reach any of these squares, the game is winning for white. And this is going to be crucial, because the first thing you have to know in king and pawn versus king and pawn endings are the rules when the pawns are on the same file, because these tend to be much more complicated. When the pawns are on the same file, there are two criteria for one side to win. One of the criteria is to be able to capture your opponent's pawn, and the other one is to be able to occupy one of the critical squares. So in this position, white can only win if he takes the d6 pawn, and then if he manages to occupy either e6, d6 or c6. In any other cases, the game is going to be a draw. We're going to be looking at some positions like this. So we're going to be firstly looking at this position with white to play and then with black to play. With white to play, if you know that you have to capture the pawn and that you have to occupy one of the critical squares, the game is simple. King g4, king d7, king f5, these are the most precise moves, king e7. And now after king e4, which is the only way to advance, black plays king e6, meaning that he has the opposition. So if the white king wishes to repeat the moves, then let's say king f4, king f6, black has the opposition, he can repeat. But if he wants to make progress, the only move is d5, and that's the reserve tempo. We are also going to be setting up some positions with the pawns which are close together. So in this position, the black king has to move. The most precise move is king e7. After king e7, white of course wants to infiltrate the position, so he plays king f5. And here we come to the point where the opposition is crucial. In this example, if black wants to keep the opposition and draw the game, he needs to play the move king f7. After king f7, white has no way to make progress. King g4, king g6, king f4, king f6, king e4, king g5. The black king is the only one who can make any progress now. If white didn't want to do that, he can then repeat with king g5, and black will just keep the opposition. An easy way for black to lose the game, if he doesn't know the rule of the opposition, is trying to play a more active defense closer to the pawns. And let's say he plays king d7. This position is now easily winning for white because of king f6 and infiltration, and white is going to be able to both take the d6 pawn and occupy one of its critical squares. Of the d5 pawn in this case. So king e8 should be the most resilient. King e6 Regardless of what black plays king f8 or king d8, let's say he plays king d8, white now takes on d6, and it's obvious that white has the opposition, the black king has to move, white infiltrates and wins. So in positions like this one, it's crucial to be able to calculate where your king is going to be, and it's crucial to be able to calculate whether you are going to be able to get the opposition or your opponent or not. In the case with black to play, a draw is easily achieved, much more easily, and in fact the chances to lose are much slimmer. King c7, let's say king g4 by white, which is the best move, king c6, king f3, king d5, king e3, king c4, d5, white can let go of the pawn, and we are going to talk about this motif later on, but let's say white tries to be resilient, king e4, let's say d5 check, king e3, and then king c3, and the only thing white has to do now is keep the opposition in some way. It's obvious that he cannot go to e4, defending the pawn, so he's going to lose the pawn on his next turn, but when he moves to e2 and black captures, then white is going to play the move king d2, and the game is going to be easily drawing. If I turn on the engine, you can see that black has no way to win. White only has to keep the opposition in order to draw the game. And if you haven't seen the video on the opposition, you can watch it because it will clarify things. But one of the most important things in positions where the pawns are on the same file is to be able to keep the opposition and to understand the fact that you can sacrifice one of your pawns. In this case, after king c7, if black's to move, white has no other chance of drawing if he doesn't sacrifice the pawn. But you need to be aware that even if your opponent is a pawn up and you can keep the opposition, which we just saw, the game is still a draw. The examples are slightly different when the pawns are on the h files, because now we are aware that the pawn's critical squares, for example, for the h6 pawns, the critical squares are g7 and g8, which means that if white is able to occupy one of these squares, it's going to be an easy win, and white is going to promote. Conversely, black either has to control the promotion squares, but black can also get to the corner. Another thing that black can do is trap the white king in the corner. So let's say we have a position in which the white king managed to capture an h7, but the black king is on f6. And then when white takes on h7, black is going to play king f7, and the white king isn't going to have a way out, so it's going to be an easy draw. So the positions with the pawns on the same file, when it's the rook file, h file, or the a file, are a bit more similar. In this example, it really depends on who is to play. This is just a random example, and it's always going to be different. I said that these aren't as precise, and you can't really formulate a certain set of rules for king and pawn versus king and pawn, and it's always going to be vital to look at two criteria. One of them is the proximity of your king to the pawn, to your opponent's pawn, and the second one is the proximity of the pawn to the queening square. In this example, of course, if it's white to play, his king is closer. So king d6, king g3, king e5, king g4, king f6, king h5, king g7, and you can see that the black king is losing because after king g5, king takes h7. Black is not able to control one of the queening squares, nor is he able to stop the white king from escaping to g8. So if the black king plays king f6, white is going to play king g8 and simply queen. If the black king tries to be resilient with king h5, then the white king is simply going to play king g7 and queen the pawn. However, if it's black to play, he plays king g3, king d6, king f4, king e6, king g5, king e5, and now you can see that white wasn't even able to reach the pawns. The best he could have gone for, which we see after king g5, king e5, is, if you remember, king and pawn versus king, white knows that if he manages to reach the corner, the queening squares, or the critical squares, he is going to be able to draw. So in this case, after king takes h6, the draw is fairly simple, and there's nothing black can do about it. White is going to be stuck in the corner, and regardless of what black does, white is simply going to, let's say he doesn't lose the pawn, white is simply going to repeat the moves. In this case, if h2 is played, it's going to be stalemate. So in the positions with rook pawns, you are going to have to calculate the distance between your king and the pawns, but the critical thing to understand is that you can control the critical squares, you can control the queening square, the corner, or you can shoulder the white king, in this case, away by not letting him exit the position after he captures your pawn. Of course, the situation is going to be different depending on where the pawns are, and the examples are going to be versatile, but if you remember some basic rules, then it's going to be easier to understand. The following example, is another principle which you should know, and this position is fairly thematic. This is the same position that we had on the H file. Now we have it on the A file, and this position is winning for white, but it's winning only because of one principle, and that's shouldering. If you haven't heard of shouldering, that's basically keeping your opponent's king at bay while not marching directly for the pawns and not going directly to capture your opponent's pawn. So in this case, white will shoulder the black king from entering the position with king e6. After king e6, king c3. If white goes towards d6 or c6 and then to b6, it's going to be harder to win. The easiest win is king d5, and now you can see that it's really hard for the black king to make progress. The black king can continue with king b4, but now after king c6, king a5, we have king b7, and because of the shouldering that happened, white king is much closer, and the black king basically had to take a detour. So this is one principle you should remember. Remember that if you can keep your opponent's king at bay, it might be a faster way to win than marching directly for the pawns. The next example I wanted to show you is probably the most important one, and this is the one trick that you need to learn, which is going to help you draw much easily. This position visually seems losing for white, and it's obvious that the black king is much closer. So if white continues with, let's say, king c2, then the position is going to be easily winning. King d4, let's say king d2, the black king is going to take, and since black has a reserve tempo, he can still make one pawn move. It's impossible for white to gain the opposition. Even if he tries, we're going to get king d4, king d2, and now since it's black to play, black wants to provoke white from moving. He's simply going to play the move king d5, and wherever the white king moves, black is going to take the opposition, march his pawn down the board. So it's obvious that in this example, a normal approach doesn't work. And one of the most useful things, and this applies when the pawns are on adjacent files, so if white has an e pawn, this will work if black has the d pawn or the f pawn, is provoking a capture. And this is the most advanced thing in this video, and this is probably the most crucial thing which is going to get your endgame to the next level. So in this case, white can only white can only draw if he manages to get the opposition. You can already see that it's impossible to get the opposition if he tries to march his king into the opposition right away. So the one thing he can do is provoke the pawn one square further away, and this way gaining time. So the critical move here is e5. It's obvious that if black tries to march his king down the board, then white is going to capture. If black doesn't capture or move his king up the board, then white is going to advance and win the game. So black basically has only one move, and that's d takes e5. And the huge difference now is that white is able to gain the opposition. King c2, it's black to move, black has to move. King d4, and now how do you keep the opposition? King d2. King e4, king e2. And now we reach the position in the king and pawn ending that we saw in the detailed video on king and pawn endings, and in the video on the opposition, which is a complete draw. And this principle can be applied to many positions. This is something that you simply need to be able to spot in your own games. If you can provoke the black pawn one square further, or give black the move, in this case, if it's black to move after takes d takes e5, king here. If it's black to move, it's obvious that you can have the opposition. Then this is something you need to be able to do. And obviously it's not going to be the same in a real game. The positions are going to be different, but this is a principle which occurs very often. Okay. The next thing I want to look at are pawns which are not on adjacent squares, and are pawns which are far apart. And the most important thing here is going to be calculation, and that's that's the only case in king and pawn versus king and pawn where you are going to have to rely purely on calculation. This can also be applied to positions where, let's say, both sides have the f pawn. Both sides have pawns on the third file, so let's say white has a pawn on f4 and black has a pawn on c5. So the two most important factors are the proximity of the king to the opponent's pawn and the proximity of the pawn to the queening square. Now if you draw a square for both pawns, It's obvious that they have the same number of squares to the promotion square, and it's obvious in this position that whoever is to play wins. So in this case, if white is to play, he's simply going to play h4. And now if it's black to play, if we draw the square of the pawn, you can see that the black king is unable to enter the square, thus the pawn is going to march up the board. Conversely, if it's black to play, black is simply going to play a5. If we draw the square of the pawn, you can see that the white king is unable to enter the square and black is winning. So in positions like these, it's crucial to know the rule of the square, and it's crucial to be able to calculate several moves in advance to be able to see whether your king can enter the square or not, and whether your pawn is fast enough. And these positions are going to be what occurs most often. I'm not saying it's going to be pawns on the h and the a file, but it's going to be similar to that. If we look at a more complex example, where white has a pawn on c4 and black has a pawn on f6, it's crucial to understand these principles. And I've also set the kings into the middle of the board so that you can see what's highly likely to happen in a real game. So in this example, the game is basically a draw. White plays, black plays, it's a draw. Because you can understand the rule of the square and the rule of the critical squares. For the c4 pawn, the square is comprised of the square g4, g8, c4, and c8, and it's obvious that the black king is within the square. For the f6 pawn, the square is f6, f1, a1, a6, and it's obvious that the white king, which is currently standing on d4, is in the square. The second thing is that both kings are able to reach the critical squares of their opponent's pawn. You can see that for the f6 pawn, the critical squares are e4, f4, g4. For the c4 pawn, the critical squares are b6, c6, d6. And regardless of what white does here, black is either going to be able to queen his pawn while white queens his pawn, or he's going to be able to capture white's pawn while white captures black's pawn. So let's say white continues with the most active move c5, forcing the black king back. The black king now has to try and stop the pawn, so king d7, king d5 by white, the most active move. And now you could apply the principle of the opposition here, and I'm not saying that this position is winning if the pawn is not on the board, but black still has a pawn, and now black can simply play the move f5, not giving the white king time to march his own pawn up the board and to try and win. So now the white king will simply have to play king e5, king c6, takes, and it's a draw. So in most positions, the situation is going to be like this. Of course, there are going to be exceptions. Of course, one side is going to be superior, and what's going to help you in understanding the position is critical squares and rule of the square. Calculate the proximity of your pawn to the queening square, calculate whether your king is within the square of your opponent's pawn, and then calculate what are the critical squares for your pawn and for your opponent's pawn. That's going to make understanding those positions much easier. Now let's look at a very hard example. In this position, white is to play, and it seems that the position is hopeless. However, there is one more principle which you can't really call a rule, which can be applied to king and pawn versus king and pawn endings and to other pawn endgames, which is extremely useful. And that's moving towards both goals simultaneously. In this case, the black pawn is marching up the board, and you can see that since its square is here, the white king, even though it's white to play, is unable to reach the square. So if white tries, let's say king h7, the pawn cannot be caught. That means that white would be simply losing with the move king h7. On the other hand, the black king is very close to the white pawn. So if white now plays the move c7, black is simply going to play king b7, and if white tries to queen, black is going to capture, and on his next move he is going to queen the pawn. So that approach doesn't work either. So one thing that white can try, and I'm not saying it works always, I'm just saying that it's the best chance when the pawns are too far apart and when you are seemingly losing, you can try moving towards both targets. So in this case, white has to try to both stop the black pawn from advancing towards the queening square h1, and he has to start supporting his own pawn on c3, and that will basically force black to a decision. Does he want to lose his pawn, or does he want to allow white to queen? In either case, this position is going to be a draw. It's not always going to be a draw, but very often this principle is going to help. Now, how does white start moving towards both the c6 pawn and the h5 pawn? Simply by playing king g7. And now let's say white is faced with the best move by black, h4, trying to queen. Now how do you continue moving towards c3 and h4, c6 and h4 once again? You play the move king f6, moving towards both pawns. Let's say black continues to queen his pawn. Now you simply, since you are unable to catch the pawn, since black chose to move his pawn farther away, now you play the move king e6, moving towards your pawn, and now you can see that if black plays king b6, which is the best move, king b6, now you are able to play king d7, and if you know the rule of the critical squares, then for the pawns on the 6th rank, the critical squares are squares both rows above the pawn, so in this case b7, b8, c7, c8, and d7, d8. And since the white king managed to reach d7, this position is now white is now able to queen. So let's say h2 for black, c7, black queens, and white queens, and this position is a draw. And this is the second most important thing about king and pawn versus king and pawn. Moving your king towards both goals, moving your king both towards stopping your opponent's pawn and promoting your own pawns. This is actually a study composed by Richard Reti in 1921, and it's one of the most extreme examples of how this works, but very often, and you'd be surprised, this is going to work in regular games. Another position I want to look at, and I'm going to set it up on the board. Sorry for now using the board editor, I didn't adjust the board for that. I'll set it up really quick. Okay, here, and the pawn here. Let's say the white king is on f3, let's say the black king is on c6. Analysis board. Okay, this is one of the most famous examples of king and pawn versus king and pawn. And now once again, this scares a lot of people, and a lot of people don't understand it, and it's really easy to blunder here. But the main thing you have to remember once again is that even though you cannot capture your opponent's pawn, even though your opponent might be able to capture your pawn, if you can manage to get the opposition, then you're going to be able to draw. So once again, let's repeat the rules. White can only win this position if he manages to win d5, and if he manages to control one of the critical squares of the d4 pawn, meaning e6, d6, and c6. Black can only win if he manages to take d4 and to control one of the critical squares of the d5 pawn, meaning c3, d3, and d3. Now in this position, if it's white to move, and you turn on the engine, well, firstly, you can try and solve this position by yourself. And try to pause the video. What's the position like if it's white to move? What's the position like if it's black to move? But let's just look at the position first. Let's say white plays the move king f4, which seems like the most logical move, marching towards the d5 pawn. And now let's say black blunders. Let's say black plays the worst move, king c6. After king c6, you can see that white can play king e5, and the black king is no longer able to protect the pawn. And now, in this position, black can blunder once more with the move king d7. If black plays king d7, and white takes the pawn, now white has the opposition, black has to move, and white is winning. So in this case, white is going to be winning. But after king e5, if black wants to be resilient, then he can play the move king c7, and now white captures the pawn. Black plays king d7 now he has the opposition, and the position is once again a draw. So these are the rules that you have to know. Let's put the position back. If I turn on the engine now, and try to win with white, we already looked at king f4. Let's say the black king defends this way, king here, and this is precisely what I got on my board, and this is the easiest way I know how to draw. So king c7, and once the king takes, then king d7, and this position is now obviously a draw. If it's black to play, the position is similar, and you need to be able to understand that even if you lose your pawn, you're able to draw if you get the opposition. So much more important than trying to calculate all the variations with all the moves where your king and your opponent's king can go, much more important is understanding whether you can gain the opposition once you lose your pawn. So in this case, black is certainly going to lose the pawn. If it's black to play here, white is going to lose the pawn. The crucial thing to understand after king e5 is that if you play king d7, you don't have the opposition. So that's basically the only blunder you can play. Okay, you can blunder with king b6 and king b7, but that's not that obvious. So king c7 and the draw should be agreed. So positions like these I wanted to mention at the end because they often scare people, but they're actually The same thing we were looking at in the king and pawn versus king video, the same thing we were looking at in the video on the opposition. You need to be able to understand opposition and critical squares. If you understand that, all of these endings are going to be easy for you to understand. You might be losing in the position, but at least you are going to know that you are losing. If you are winning, you are going to be able to win. And if the game is a draw, you are going to draw without having to calculate too much. So once again, to conclude, remember the rule of the square, remember the critical squares for each pawn, remember opposition, these are the most important factors, and remember that when the pawns are on the same file, which are the hardest king and pawn versus king and pawn endings, you can only win if you win the pawn and if you control the critical squares. If you win the pawn but your opponent manages to get the opposition and or control the critical squares, then it's a draw. Okay, thanks very much. I hope you liked the video. As always, I'm going to be setting up some tasks and exercises to go a bit more in depth for the daily PDF for the patrons. Let me know what you think about king and pawn versus king and pawn endings. If I've missed something, please point it out. If I made a mistake, which is possible, and I unfortunately do it sometimes, please point that out as well. I would be happy to hear it. And stay tuned for more chess. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.